Nobody in that ballroom was watching Delia Marsh. That was the point. That had always been the point. She moved through the crowd the way she always did. Carefully, deliberately, making herself as small as possible, despite the fact that she was, as her mother used to say with the particular brand of French-Canadian bluntness, that skipped tact entirely, not a small woman. 260 pounds of Irish-Ukrainian girl from Sudbury, Ontario, dressed in a black and white server's uniform that her supervisor's Gwen had handed her that morning, with the warning that she'd need to keep up tonight. Delia had kept up. She always kept up. She just did it quietly, without anyone noticing. The Vandermeer estate sat on the edge of Westmount, Montreal's oldest money folded into its limestone walls and leaded windows, and tonight it was dressed up for an engagement party that had cost more than Delia made in 3 years. She knew this because she'd helped set the tables, $14,000 worth of orchids alone. She'd counted them while she arranged the centerpieces at 7 that morning, talking herself out of feeling anything about it. She was good at that, talking herself out of feelings. The guests were the kind of people who wore their wealth the way other people wore skin. Naturally, without thinking about it. Women in gowns that whispered when they walked. Men who laughed too loudly at their own stories. Delia navigated between them with a tray of champagne flutes, saying, "Pardon me," and "of course," and "right away," making herself background noise. It was the woman in the corner who stopped her. Not stopped her literally. The woman wasn't looking at Delia. She wasn't looking at much of anything, really, and that was what caught Delia's attention. Because at a party like this, everyone was looking at something. The chandelier, the other guests. Their own reflections in the mirrored walls. But this woman sat alone in a chair near the fireplace, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing with an expression Delia recognized immediately. Her grandmother had worn that same expression in the last 2 years of her life. Lost. Suspended somewhere between here and a place no one else could see. The woman's name, Delia would learn later, was Constance Aldrin. She was 73 years old, and she was the mother of the most dangerous man in the province of Quebec. But right then, Delia didn't know any of that. She only knew that someone's grandmother was sitting alone at a loud party, frightened and confused, and nobody was paying any attention to her at all. She set her tray down on the nearest surface and crossed the room. "Hi there," she said, keeping her voice low and steady, the way she used to talk to her own grand-mère during the bad spells. "Are you doing okay? Can I get you some water?" Constance Aldrin looked up at her. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and for a moment they held nothing. No recognition, no comprehension, no awareness of where she was. Then something shifted, some small anchor catching. "I don't know where I am," the woman said quietly. "You're at a party," Delia told her, settling into the empty chair beside her without asking permission. "A fancy one. Too loud, honestly. Would you like to go somewhere quieter?" The woman nodded, and Delia helped her up gently, one hand at her elbow, and guided her toward the corridor that led to the library. She'd found it that morning during setup. Tall shelves, leather chairs, a gas fireplace that the staff had been told not to touch. It was empty now. Quiet. She settled Constance into the armchair nearest the fire and pulled a side table close. "My son is here somewhere," Constance said. "I'll let him know where you are," Delia said, though she had no idea who her son was. "You just rest a minute. What's your name, Constance?" A pause. "I think I had a coat. I'll find it." Delia tucked her own serving jacket around the woman's shoulders. "There. Better." Constance looked at her with sudden, startling clarity. "You have kind eyes," she said. "My mother had kind eyes." Delia smiled. "That's a lovely thing to say." She stayed with the woman for 10 minutes, talking about nothing in particular. The snow that was coming this weekend, whether the orchids were real or silk, the way the fireplace made a sound like a cat sleeping. Constance Aldrin drifted in and out of the present, but she stayed calm, and her hands unfolded from their tight grip in her lap, and by the time Delia heard footsteps in the corridor, she was almost asleep. The footsteps belonged to a woman who was not calm at all. She appeared in the library doorway in a column of ivory silk, And she was beautiful in the particular way of someone who had worked very hard to be beautiful and wanted you to know it. Dark hair, high cheekbones, lips pressed into a line that had nothing to do with happiness. "What is going on?" she said, her voice carrying the clipped consonants of old Outremont money. "Mother Constance, why are you in here?" "The toast is in 20 minutes. She needed a quiet moment, Delia said, keeping her voice neutral. She seemed a little overwhelmed by the crowd. The woman, Delia still didn't know her name, but she was wearing an engagement ring the size of a small country, so she had some idea of the relationship. Transferred her gaze to Delia with an expression that managed to convey, in a single sweep, that she found Delia's existence mildly offensive. "I didn't ask you," she said. "I know," Delia said. "I'm just explaining. You're a server." She said it the way you'd say you're a stain. You don't get to make decisions about where family members go. You don't get to touch family members. You don't get to be in this room at all. She asked me for help. She doesn't know what she's asking for. She has dementia. The word landed hard and flat, deployed like a fact rather than felt like one. She doesn't know what she's saying half the time. And you took advantage of that to drag her in here. For what? What exactly were you hoping to get out of this? Delia felt the familiar heat crawl up the back of her neck. She knew this kind of accusation. She'd faced it before. The particular suspicion directed at people who looked like her, who came from where she came from, who showed up in spaces they weren't expected to occupy. The assumption that kindness must be concealing an angle. "I wasn't hoping to get anything," she said quietly. "I just didn't want her to be alone." The woman stepped into the room. Up close, she smelled like something expensive, and her eyes were cold in the way of someone who had learned early that coldness was a form of power. "You need to leave," she said, "right now, before I have you removed." Delia looked at Constance, who had opened her eyes at the sound of raised voices, and was watching the two of them with that same lost, frightened expression. "I'll go," Delia said. She set her jacket more carefully around Constance's shoulders and stood. "I'll just go find your son, ma'am, and let him know you're in here." "You'll do nothing of the sort, Vivienne." The voice came from the doorway. It was a quiet voice, controlled. The kind of quiet that comes not from gentleness but from absolute certainty that it will be heard. And it was heard. Vivienne stopped mid-sentence and turned with the particular freeze of someone who has heard that tone before and knows what it means. The man in the doorway was not what Delia would have expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Some slick figure in an expensive suit, maybe, something that matched the setting. What she got was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered in a way that didn't come from a gym, silver threading through dark hair at his temples. He wore a suit that fit the way only custom tailoring fit, but he wore it the way working men wore their Sunday clothes, like an obligation rather than an identity. His face had been lived in. There were lines around his eyes, and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, and something in his expression that said he had seen a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. He was looking at his mother. "Mummin." He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched down in front of her chair, and his entire bearing changed. The hard edges of him softened at the edges, and he took her hands in his. "Comment tu vas? How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," Constance said, with sudden dignity. "This young woman has been keeping me company. She found me a quiet place to sit." She glanced at Delia. "What was your name again, dear?" "Delia," she said. "Delia. She has kind eyes, Edouard." The man, Edouard, looked up at Delia then. It was a brief look, measuring, taking in detail without seeming to. Then he stood. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Simple. But he meant them, and that was rarer than it should have been. "Of course," Delia said. She started to move toward the door. "Wait." She stopped. He was still watching her, and she felt, with the particular self-consciousness of someone who had spent a lifetime being assessed for things beyond her control, the full weight of that gaze. But it was not unkind. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite name. "Where did you come from, originally?" It was an odd question. "Sudbury," she said. "I moved to Montreal 4 years ago. My mother. Did she ask you to stay with her, or did you stay because you decided to?" Delia thought about it, honestly. Both, she said. She didn't have to ask, but she did. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But something in the direction of one. I see, he said. Vivienne made a sound in the back of her throat. Edouard, the guests are waiting, the toast. Give us a moment, Vivienne. She left, not gracefully. Delia should have left too. She understood that. She was a server, not a guest. And she had a tray of champagne somewhere back in the ballroom going warm, and Gwen would be looking for her. But something kept her there for a moment. Some awareness that this man with the lived-in face and the careful eyes was looking at her with an attention she hadn't encountered before in this particular context. The context of this uniform, this room, this party. You knew what was happening with her, he said. You recognized it. My grandmère had dementia. I spent a lot of time with her. Is she still alive? No. He nodded once, slowly. I'm sorry. She had a good life, Delia said. A long one. She was funny until near the end. She made the best tourtière I've ever had, and she swore like a docker when she dropped things. She stopped herself. Sorry. That's probably more than you wanted, but something in his expression said it wasn't. Your name is Delia, he said. With the catering company or with the estate? Catering company. I'm usually on the hotel circuit. This is a special booking. Where are you normally based? This was an unusual number of questions. Le Méridien, mostly. Some of the old hotels on Sherbrooke. He reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a card. He held it out and she took it because she didn't know what else to do, and it was plain white with a phone number and nothing else. No name, no title. Call that number tomorrow, he said. I may have a position that would suit you better. Delia looked at the card. She looked at him, she said with the Sudbury directness her mother had never quite managed to scrub out of her. I don't know who you are. No, he said. That's all right. He moved to sit beside his mother, and the conversation was clearly over, and Delia walked back through the corridor and into the ballroom with a plain white card in her hand and the feeling that something had just shifted in a way she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she understood. She called the number the next morning because she was 26 years old. And she had $47 in her checking account, and her lease was up in 6 weeks, and whatever that card represented, it was more than she currently had. A woman answered. Her name was Sylvette, and she spoke with a Joliette accent and gave nothing away, and she asked Delia a series of questions that were practical without being personal. Availability, references, experience with formal household management. Delia answered them honestly. Sylvette said she would be in touch. She was in touch by that afternoon. The position was as household manager for a private residence in Outremont, full-time. Live-in option available. The salary she quoted made Delia sit down on the edge of her kitchen table because she had never heard that number directed at her before in any context. Sylvette explained the household's requirements. Discretion, reliability, care of an elderly resident with cognitive decline, and the ability to manage a small supporting staff. The elderly resident, Delia said carefully, is that Constance Aldrin? Yes, Sylvette said. And the principal, Delia said. His name is Edouard Aldrin? A pause. You can look him up if you like, Sylvette said, in a tone that suggested this was being offered as an opportunity to reconsider. Delia looked him up. She sat with her laptop at the kitchen table for an hour. There was not a great deal. Edouard Aldrin was not a man who accumulated press coverage, and what existed was oblique, full of phrases like alleged connections and sources close to the investigation, and declined to comment. He appeared in photographs at charity galas and business dinners, always at the edge of the frame, never centered. There were 2 news articles from the late 90s about a criminal investigation in which he had not been charged. There was a piece from a business magazine about commercial real estate holdings across Quebec and Ontario that were significant enough to make Delia's eyes water a little. And there were the things that were not written anywhere, that lived in the spaces between the paragraphs, in the careful language, and the unasked questions. And the fact that she had been at his mother's engagement party and seen the way certain men in the room tracked his movements without appearing to. She knew what he was. She was not naive. She called Sylvette back. I have a question, she said. All right. My job would be to take care of Constance Aldrin. That's the job. Whatever else happens in that house, whoever comes and goes, whatever business gets discussed, that's not my business, and I don't involve myself in it." "That is correct," Sylvette said. "And Constance, she'd be safe, she'd be cared for. That's genuinely the point of this, Mr. Aldrin's primary concern is his mother's well-being and comfort. That is not a performance. If you're asking whether you can trust that part of it, the answer is yes." Delia thought about the way his face had changed when he'd crossed the room to his mother, the way he'd crouched down, the way he'd taken her hands. "Okay," she said, "I'll take it." The house was not what she'd expected either. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something intimidating, maybe. Something that announced itself the way the Vandermeer estate had announced itself, all carved stone and deliberate grandeur. The Aldrin residence on Avenue Maplewood was a large Victorian semi-detached, red brick going slightly rosy at the edges, with a garden in the back that was overgrown in the comfortable way of gardens that had been well loved for decades and had now run slightly ahead of the people tending them. There were geraniums on the front step in pots that needed watering. Delia watered them on her way in. The interior was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Not warm in temperature, though it was, but warm in the way of a house that had been lived in for a long time, by people who cooked and argued and put their feet on the furniture. The kitchen was large and slightly cluttered and smelled like coffee and something with time in it that was going on the back burner. The hallways had photographs. The sitting room had books stacked on the floor beside the armchairs because the shelves were full. Constance Aldrin was in the garden. She was moving along the back fence in her housecoat and her rubber garden boots, dead-heading the roses with a small pair of clippers and speaking to them in low, companionable French. She looked up when Delia appeared in the garden door and regarded her with the frank assessment of someone who had not entirely lost her ability to read people. "You're the young woman from the party," she said. "I am," Delia said. She was surprised. There had been no guarantee of that. Memory, with dementia, worked on its own schedule. "You remember kind eyes," Constance said. "I remember kind eyes." She held out the clippers. "Come help me with these. My hands have been getting tired." Delia took the clippers. They worked in the garden for an hour that morning, and Constance told her about the roses. Which ones her late husband Marcel had planted, which ones she had planted herself after he died, which ones had simply appeared from somewhere and been allowed to stay on the grounds that they were clearly meant to be there. She drifted in and out of the timeline of her life, picking up and setting down decades like she was sorting through old correspondence. Delia listened and asked careful questions, and did not try to pull her back when she wandered, only waited and followed. By the time they went in for lunch, Constance had called her Delia 4 times without prompting. That was how it began. She had been in the house 3 weeks before she saw Edouard Aldrin again. He was not absent. He lived there, she understood that. But his schedule kept hours that didn't align with hers. She heard him sometimes, late at night or early in the morning when she was up with Constance during a bad spell. The kitchen light would be on. Voices, low, that stopped when she appeared. She had learned, very quickly, the particular skill of making herself peripheral. When he did appear, a Thursday evening, walking into the kitchen while Delia was making tourtière, because Constance had asked for it, and Delia's Grand Mère's recipe was close enough to make her cry a little when the smell hit the air. He stopped in the doorway and said, "That smell. Your mother asked for it," Delia said, without turning from the stove. She hasn't had it since Christmas. He came in and sat at the kitchen table with the ease of someone at home in kitchens, which surprised her. "She's been better since you came. She's been having a good stretch," Delia said carefully. "It won't be permanent. You know that." "I know." A pause. "I'm not looking for permanent, I'm looking for good stretches." She glanced at him then. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands loose, and he was watching her cook with an expression she still couldn't quite categorize. It was attention, she thought. Plain, unguarded attention, the kind that felt strange when you weren't used to receiving it. "How was she this week?" he asked. Delia told him honestly. "The good moments. And the harder ones. The Wednesday afternoon when Constance had been convinced it was 1987, and Marcel was coming home for dinner. The way they had gotten through it together. He listened the way people listened when the information mattered to them, not just when politeness required it. "Does it frighten you?" he asked, "being with her when she goes into those states?" "No," she said. "It used to frighten me with my grandmère, but I learned that being frightened makes it worse for them. They can feel it, so you just," she searched for the right words, "you just go where they are. You meet them there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're better at this than anyone we've had before." "I've had practice," Delia said. "Why did you take the job?" he asked. "You knew who I was by the time you agreed. I know you looked it up." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "Because the job is real," she said. "Taking care of your mother, that's a real thing that needs doing. The rest of it isn't mine to worry about." "That's a pragmatic way to look at it. I grew up with $40 worth of groceries for a family of 4, she said. "Pragmatic is the only way I know." Something moved across his face at that. Not pity. She would have been out the door for pity. Something more honest than that. "My father grew up the same way," he said. "Marcel, before he built the business." "What kind of business?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Construction," he said, in a tone that acknowledged exactly how much she understood that word to cover. She turned back to the stove. They ate dinner, the 3 of them. Because Constance appeared from upstairs at precisely 6:15, drawn by the smell, with her hair done and her cardigan buttoned, because Sunday dinner meant you dressed for it, even if it was Thursday. Edouard sat at the head of the table, and his mother sat at his right, and Delia sat at his left, because Constance had put the plate there herself. They talked about the garden. They talked about a film Constance had watched that afternoon. Edouard told a story about a mislabeled crate of bathroom tiles that had arrived at one of his building sites and ended up being installed in a corporate boardroom, and Constance laughed. A real laugh, clear and present, and entirely herself. And Delia thought, there it is, that's what he's paying for. Not management, not care schedules and medication reminders. These moments, these islands, where his mother comes back to herself and laughs at the table. He looked at Delia across the table when his mother laughed. She looked back, and something small and bright and entirely inconvenient lodged itself somewhere in her chest where she did not want it to be. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of Vivienne Rousseau. Delia hadn't forgotten about Vivienne. She had simply filed her under Not My Problem with the same efficiency she filed most things she couldn't control. But 6 weeks into her position at the house, Vivienne arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a shopping bag and the particular energy of someone visiting territory she believed should be hers. Constance had been having a difficult day. She'd been in 1974 most of the morning, young, anxious, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. Delia had gotten her settled in the sitting room with a cup of tea and a record, Edith Piaf, because the music reached her in ways that words sometimes couldn't, and she was doing better by the time Vivienne's heels struck the front hall. "I need to speak with her," Vivienne said, appearing in the sitting room doorway. "She's resting," Delia said. "She's sitting up with a cup of tea. She's not resting." "She's resting," Delia said again, quietly. "She's had a hard morning. She needs quiet." Vivienne's eyes moved from Delia to Constance and back. There was something calculating in it, and Delia had the uncomfortable awareness that she was being assessed for leverage. "My engagement party is in 3 weeks," Vivienne said, lowering her voice. "I need her input on the seating arrangement. She has opinions. When she's herself, then come back tomorrow morning. She's usually clearer in the mornings. I don't need to be told when to visit by the hired help." There it was. Delia looked at her steadily. "That's true," she said. "But I'm also responsible for Constance's well-being, and right now she needs peace and quiet. If you'd like to sit with her and listen to Piaf without discussing anything stressful, you're welcome to stay." Vivienne looked at her the way she'd looked at her in the library at the Vandermeer estate, like a problem that needed to be managed. "I know what you're doing," she said. "Taking care of an elderly woman with dementia. Delia said. Making yourself indispensable. Her voice dropped further, took on an edge. You think I don't see it? You're positioning yourself. You've been here 6 weeks and suddenly you're at the dinner table. You're being consulted about schedules. Edouard is. She stopped herself. Reset. He has a pattern, she said, with the controlled calm of someone recalibrating. Taking people in. People who present themselves as helpless or loyal or… I'm neither helpless nor presenting myself as anything, Delia said. I'm doing my job. Your job is to make beds and manage medications. My job is Constance Aldrin's well-being, Delia said, which right now means you lowering your voice, because she can hear us and she's starting to get distressed. She glanced toward the sitting room, where Constance had indeed gone still and tense, her hands tight around her cup. Please. Something shifted in Vivienne's expression. Not warmth, but a flicker of something more complicated. Awareness, maybe, that she'd gone further than she intended in front of a woman who noticed everything. She left. Delia went back to Constance and sat beside her and talked quietly about the garden until her hands unclenched. She told Edouard about the visit that evening. She kept it factual, reported it the way she reported anything that affected Constance's state, because that was her job, and she was not going to let whatever she felt about it make her unprofessional. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, She upset my mother. Your mother didn't realize what was happening. She just felt the tension. She's recovered fine. But Vivienne upset her. Vivienne was stressed and came on a bad day, Delia said, with more fairness than she felt entitled to give. It happens. He looked at her steadily. You're being very generous. I'm being accurate. Delia. Her name in his mouth with a particular weight on it. I want your honest assessment, not the diplomatic version. She held his gaze. Vivienne doesn't understand your mother's condition, she said. She treats it as an inconvenience rather than a reality. That's not cruelty. It might just be that she doesn't know how. But it means she's going to make things harder, not easier, when she's here, and your mother is going to need more time to settle afterward. A pause. That's my honest assessment. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the November wind was picking up, throwing the last of the maple leaves against the kitchen window. Her engagement to me is not what it appears, he said at last. It was said simply, without dramatic weight. It's a business arrangement. She understands that. I understood it before she became. He paused, searching. Before she became comfortable claiming territory. Delia said nothing. My mother likes her, he said. Liked her in the beginning, when things were clearer. Another pause. I thought that mattered more than it does. It still matters, Delia said quietly. He looked at her then, a long, open look that she found, as always, difficult to hold and impossible to look away from. You are very careful with everyone's feelings except your own, he said. It's easier that way, she said. He didn't smile. But something in his eyes said he understood that, precisely and completely, in the way that people who do the same thing always recognize it in others. The night everything changed was in December. Delia heard it before she saw it. Raised voices in the front hallway, Vivienne's and someone else's, a man's voice she didn't recognize. Sharp consonants. A tone that meant something beyond a social disagreement. She was coming down from Constance's room, a late-night check after a restless evening, and she stopped at the top of the stairs with her hand on the banister and listened. The man was talking about money, large amounts, and a name she'd heard around the edges of things, Bertrand. He was talking about Bertrand. He was saying that Bertrand's people were asking questions, and that the asking of questions was a problem, and that the problem led back to Vivienne. Delia understood. All at once. With the clarity of someone who had been paying close attention to everything around them for 6 weeks, without letting themselves think too hard about what it added up to, exactly what was being said. Vivienne had been speaking to someone she shouldn't have been speaking to, and in the world Edouard Aldrin occupied, that was not a small thing. She turned around and went back to Constance's room and sat very quietly in the chair by the window until the voices stopped. Edouard found her there 20 minutes later. He appeared in the doorway and took in the scene, Delia in the chair, awake, Constance asleep, and something in his face was very controlled. "You heard," he said, not a question. "I heard voices," she said carefully. "I came down the stairs and decided that going back up was the better option." He came into the room and stood by the window and looked out at the street for a moment. "I need to ask you something," he said at last. "All right, are you frightened? Right now? Of me? Of what you may be understanding about the situation you're in?" Delia considered this honestly. She looked at his profile against the window, the lines of it, the weight of it, the particular exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "No," she said. "You should be," he said quietly. "Practically speaking." "Probably," she agreed. "But I've been watching you with your mother for 6 weeks. People are who they are in those moments. You don't perform that." A pause. "And I grew up in a neighborhood where knowing which men were dangerous and which men were violent was a practical skill. You're dangerous. That's different." He turned from the window and looked at her. "Vivienne," he said, "will be asked to leave. Tonight." He said it the way he said everything, quietly, without emphasis, as if the decision had already been made and announcing it was simply a formality. "That's your business," she said. "It affects you," he said. "It affects my mother. Your mother will be fine. She adjusts better than you think." Delia looked down at her own hands for a moment. "Can I ask you something now?" "Yes. What happens to Vivienne after she leaves?" A long pause. "She goes back to her father's house in Saint-Lambert," he said. "She was never in danger. That was never going to be what happened to her." He said it levelly, watching her face. "Is that what you were worried about?" "Yes," Delia said honestly. Something shifted in his expression, opened slightly around the edges. "You are a very strange person to find in my kitchen," he said. "You hired me." "I know I did." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she felt the full weight of his attention again. Not the measuring kind she'd learned to expect, but something more unguarded. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back upstairs." "Thank you for asking if I was frightened," she said. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people aren't in my house. That's fair." He looked, for a brief and surprising moment, like he might actually laugh. He didn't. But it was close. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll be up to check on her at 4. I'll be up at 4 too," she said. "You don't have to be." "I know," she said. "I will be anyway." He left. Delia looked out the window at the Outremont Street, at the snow that had started falling sometime in the last hour, coating the garden and the red brick and the roses that had gone bare weeks ago, and she sat with the small, bright, inconvenient thing in her chest and didn't try to talk herself out of it. For the first time in a long time, she didn't. Constance stirred in the bed behind her and murmured something. Marcel, maybe, or a word in Old French that Delia didn't recognize. She reached back without looking and put her hand over the old woman's hand, and Constance stilled. And they stayed like that in the dark and the snow while the house settled around them. And whatever came next, whatever complicated and uncertain shape the future had in this particular house, Delia Marsh from Sudbury, Ontario, was not looking away from it. She never had been.